Thank you, Lisa, for the nice introduction, and thanks everybody for coming out this morning to hear the talk. As Lisa's already stated, the title of my paper and the research that I'll be discussing today is Are Some Emotions Marked Whites Only? Racialized Feeling Rules in Professional Workplaces. And it's purposefully sort of a provocative title because I think that it really draws attention to these issues around race and emotions and... Not on? Thank you. Oh, is this okay? Okay. I think that it, thank you, draws attention to these issues of race and emotion and power and the ways in which they work in the workplace and in labor markets in ways that are often unnoticed or taken for granted by both those who are sometimes doing this sort of emotion work and those who are on the receiving end of it. I got interested in this topic out of sort of my broader interest in questions about race and gender and the ways in which they intersect in various workplaces and different occupations and professions. And in so doing was really trying to address some of the points that Lisa just brought up. This idea of trying to focus on how research in various areas that's been very strong in focusing on gender hasn't been so good in focusing on how gender is a racialized concept and vice versa. How research that focuses on racial questions perhaps hasn't necessarily taken into consideration how the issues and problems and results may look differently if we complicate race by focusing on gender. So what I try to do in this research is to really consider a topic that's gotten a lot of attention in gender research and to complicate it by thinking about the way in which race plays a part. So in doing so, I ground this work in the literature on emotions at work, and this is a pretty large area in the sociology of emotions research. That, in other words, a lot of research on sociology of emotions has really focused a lot on the ways in which this type of emotion performance really serves to replicate gender inequality. That, in other words, there's a lot of focus on how the ways in which emotions are performed and the ways in which emotions become used as part of the workforce actually work in such a way that women become disadvantaged by virtue of the emotional work that they have to do. And I'm going to talk more about this in a minute, but I want to just give a general overview of this type of argument and this type of work. Much of the research in this area has focused on the legal field, and this is less a reflection of the particularities of this in the field, a more reflection of the researchers who have done this type of work. But there's been a lot of focus on the ways in which people who are attorneys and people who are paralegals end up doing emotion work in a way that really replicates gender inequality. So we find that in this existing research, women who are attorneys find themselves being barred or excluded from the type of emotional performance that becomes sanctioned for male attorneys. That when male attorneys are expected to offer a sort of emotional performance of being angry or very forceful, for women attorneys who try to adopt this, it becomes seen as them being shrill or somehow unfeminine and inappropriate. And a similar paradigm is present in the research that talks about paralegals, that for men paralegals, they're much more able to get away with an emotional performance where they are brusque or distant or emotionally detached than are their female counterparts. And again, overall, the research in this area has really focused on the ways in which this manifests gender imbalances in the workplace and serves to take a toll, a disproportionate toll, on women who are employed in these professions and serves to maintain gender stratification. What isn't given a lot of attention in this research is the racial nature of the workplace. The fact that most professional workplaces often tend to be disproportionately comprised of white professionals, with few, professionals of color being few and far between. And the fact that the emotional culture and the organizational culture of many professional workplaces is also one that, according to existing literature, can be rather inhospitable or at least uncomfortable at some times for professionals of color. But a lot of this isn't really given due attention in the existing research. So what I try to do is to consider what the implications are for workers of color when they're in this sort of dynamic and in this sort of organizational setting, and they're expected to also do this sort of emotion work. So in order to address these questions, I ground my research in Rosabeth Moss Kanter's very well-known theory of the token hypothesis, or her theory of tokenism. And Kanter's token hypothesis purports to explain the experiences of those who find themselves in the numerical minority. And what Kanter does in this study is she studies the experiences of men and women who are executives in an unnamed corporation. And she focuses on the experiences that women have in this corporation in particular as members of the numerical minority. And what she finds is that their membership as people who are numerically in the minority gives them a different experience than those who are part of the majority, the men who are their counterparts. Cantor argues that the token experience comprises this sort of weird situation of being very highly visible but at the same time often invisible. And she argues that this works to the token's disadvantage because they tend to be highly visible as people who are different or people who stand out. And they tend to be different when issues come up that are assumed to be things to which they can relate. But other than that, they often find themselves feeling very invisible as part of the general nature of the work environment. She also argues that tokens are subject to stereotypes and isolation, that they are subject to this within the workplace, and that they are seen as a representative of their particular group. And again, with Cantor's work, she's focusing specifically on the experiences of women in a male-dominated corporation, but the arguments she makes are that this token experience applies to anyone who finds themselves in the numerical minority. Now, there's been later research that really questions whether or not that conclusion in and of itself is true. Christina Williams' excellent book, Still a Man's World, actually looks at men who are numerically tokens in predominantly female occupations and finds that they don't necessarily experience the same sort of dynamic. But again, this still really grounds these questions in these issues of gender and whether or not the token experience is different depending on the gender of the token. What I question and what I wanted to know with this research is whether or not this experience of tokenism actually goes so far as to affect black professionals' emotional experience. So given that black professionals meet the sort of general standards of tokenism by virtue of often being one of the few in their professional work settings, what I wanted to learn was whether or not this has an impact on the ways in which their emotional performance is observed and the ways that it's judged and the ways in which they feel that they are constrained or more able or restricted or more permitted to engage in certain emotional expression. In other words, does tokenism extend to the emotional expression that black professionals feel able to engage in the professional work environment? To really contextualize this question of what this emotional performance looks like, it's necessary to ground this also in the broader literature on emotions at work that's part of the sociological tradition. The probably defining, very influential study in this field is Arlie Russell-Hochschild's book, The Managed Heart. And I have to give the caveat that I may be mispronouncing her name. I've never met her in person. I've only read her work. I think it's Hochschild, but if you know for certain, I'm happy to be corrected at the end of the lecture. But Arlie Russell-Hochschild's book, The Managed Heart, is this groundbreaking study that examines the experiences of women who are working as flight attendants and men who are working as bill collectors. And she makes this argument in this work that as we shift in our American society to still a capitalist economy, but one that is much more service-oriented than it has been in the past, what we end up being faced with is a situation where people who are in service jobs actually find themselves having to sell their emotions, that they find themselves in positions where the emotional performance that they are able to communicate as part of their jobs becomes a critical part of the work that they do. So she argues that flight attendants, by virtue of what they have to do for a living, actually have to sell passengers an experience. They have to make passengers feel a certain way as part of their jobs. They have to make them feel comfortable, they have to make them feel safe, they have to make them feel cared for. And the bill collectors, in contrast, have a different experience. By part of their jobs, they have to make people feel afraid or uncertain, or that somebody might be coming to their house to collect their money, or whatever sort of negative emotion that implies. Now again, there's also a gender dynamic to this sort of emotional work, that flight attendants are disproportionately likely to be female, bill collectors are disproportionately likely to be male. So what Hochschild argues is that this performance of emotion actually takes on gender dynamics that replicate, again, the same sort of gender inequality. She also splits the terms that she talks about into distinct categories, arguing that there's a difference between the sort of emotions that we feel that we have to communicate as part of our daily life and daily routine, and the sort of emotions that are actually tied to the labor that we do, but may not necessarily be compensated as part of our work. So Hochschild argues that emotional labor constitutes this emotional performance that we have to actually sell as part of a job. So if any of you have worked in the service industry as in a restaurant or in a coffee shop or anything like that, if you find yourselves having to make customers feel that they're getting the best service that they could possibly imagine at a Starbucks or someplace like that, she would argue that this constitutes emotional labor. This is actually work that you have to do as part of your job. In contrast, emotion management involves a sort of day-to-day emotional work that we may